Hey, it's Miss Finster. So Cooney and I decided to go ahead and have you guys watch an ed puzzle that's used by creating a video with our online e-textbook version of our history textbook. And the reason for this is because the e-textbook has audio recordings that I think is really useful to pair with the reading. So I definitely recommend that as we work through this ed puzzle together, um, that you not only listen to the audio recording of the reading, but that you're also following along as well. And that could be either by looking at the screen, but if you have your physical textbook, I would actually strongly recommend um, that you give your eyes a break from the screen and use your actual physical textbook to read along as you listen. Okay. So, in case you wanted to do that, the page that you should start on, because we're going to back it up just a little bit to start at World War II begins. So, you're going to start on page 461 in the physical textbook. But the main chapter that we're going to focus on, that will be soon after this page, is going to be Axis Powers Advance, which starts on 462. Okay? All right. So my commentary after this will be minimal, but if I have time in between the audio recording, I'll try to chip in to try to provide any hints. All right, let's begin. World War II begins.
World War II begins. Identify and write sentences using connecting words. Just as Churchill predicted, Europe plunged rapidly toward war. In March 1939, Hitler broke his promises and gobbled up the rest of Czechoslovakia. The democracies finally accepted the fact that appeasement had failed. At last, thoroughly alarmed, they promised to protect Poland, most likely the next target of Hitler's expansion. Nazi-Soviet Pact. In August 1939, Hitler stunned the world by announcing a non-aggression pact with his great enemy, Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator. Publicly, the Nazi-Soviet Pact bound Hitler and Stalin to peaceful relations. Secretly, the two agreed not to fight if the other went to war, and to divide up Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe between them. The pact was based not on friendship or respect, but on mutual need. Hitler feared communism, as Stalin feared fascism. But Hitler wanted a free hand in Poland. Also, he did not want to fight a war with the Western democracies and the Soviet Union at the same time. For his part, Stalin had sought allies among the Western democracies against the Nazi menace. Mutual suspicions, however, kept them apart. By joining with Hitler, Stalin tried to protect the Soviet Union from the threat of war with Germany and grabbed a chance to gain land in Eastern Europe.
We'll see how that works out later.
Germany invades Poland. On September 1st, 1939, a week after the Nazi-Soviet Pact, German forces invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. History had again arrived at one of its great turning points. The devastation of World War I and the awareness of the destructive power of modern technology made the idea of more fighting unbearable. Unfortunately, the war proved to be even more horrendous than anyone had imagined.
All right, I'm going to pause it there. All right, I'm going to move on to not this page, but the next one, so we can start on our main chapter, and now that you're able to answer the first three questions. I'm not going to play the audio recording on the very first page because it's just going to read off the objectives in key terms, which will be good for you to keep in mind, but they will be bolded for you in the reading, okay? We'll give you a moment to check out this image. So, unfortunately, eventually Germany does invade the Soviet Union. So Stalin's efforts unfortunately didn't work out. All right, let's start on the next one. All right. I'll show you this image real quick. So on the following page, you'll get a chance to really compare these two maps. So I just want you to take a note of 1936 to 1939. What we see currently under the Axis powers control, which isn't very much, but keep in mind this will drastically change by the time we get to the next page, okay? So at this point, it's just Austria under Germany's control, all right? Okay. This will be our longest length of reading on one single page. And a decent amount of questions will be popping up for you on here. So please pay close attention.
Axis domination of Europe. Write about what it may have felt like to live during World War II. World War II lasted from 1939 to 1945. It pitted the Axis powers against the Allies, which eventually included Britain, France, the Soviet Union, China, the United States, and 43 other nations. Unlike World War I with its defensive trenches, the new global conflict was a war of aggressive movement. In the early years, things went badly for the Allies as Axis forces swept across Europe, North Africa, and Asia. Germany's Lightning War. The Nazi invasion of Poland revealed the power of Hitler's Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. The Blitzkrieg used tank and air-powered technology to strike a devastating blow against the enemy. First, the Luftwaffe, or German Air Force, bombed airfields, factories, towns, and cities. Screaming dive bombers attacked troops and civilians. Then fast-moving tanks and troop transports pushed their way into the defending Polish army, encircling whole divisions and forcing them to surrender. As Germany attacked from the west, Stalin's forces invaded from the east, grabbing lands promised to them under the Nazi-Soviet pact. Within a month, Poland ceased to exist as an independent nation. Because of Poland's location and the speed of the attacks, Britain and France could do nothing beyond declaring war on Germany. Hitler passed the winter without much further action. Stalin's armies, however, forced the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania to host bases for the Soviet military. Soviet forces also seized part of Finland, which put up stiff but unsuccessful resistance. In April 1940, Hitler launched a blitzkrieg against Norway and Denmark, both of which soon fell. Next, his forces slammed into the Netherlands and Belgium. The rescue at Dunkirk. During that first winter, the French hunkered down behind the Maginot Line, a border created by the French in the 1930s to protect from German invasion. Britain sent troops to wait with them. Some reporters referred to this quiet time as the Phony War. In May 1940, German forces surprised the French and British by attacking through the Ardennes forest in Belgium, an area that was considered invasion-proof. Bypassing the Maginot Line, German troops poured into France. Retreating British forces were soon trapped between the Nazi army and the English Channel. In a desperate gamble, the British sent all available naval vessels, merchant ships, and even fishing and pleasure boats across the Channel to pluck stranded troops off the beach of Dunkirk. Despite German air attacks, the improvised armada ferried more than 300,000 troops to safety in Britain. This heroic rescue raised British morale. France surrenders. Meanwhile, German forces were heading south toward Paris. In June, Mussolini had declared war on France and Britain. He sent Italian troops to attack France from the south. Overrun and demoralized, France surrendered. On June 22, 1940, Hitler forced the French to sign the surrender documents in the same railroad car in which Germany had signed the armistice ending World War I. Following the surrender, Germany occupied northern France. In the south, the Germans set up a puppet state with its capital at Vichy. Some French officers escaped to England and set up a government in exile. Led by Charles de Gaulle, these free French worked to liberate their homeland. Within France, resistance fighters used guerrilla tactics against German forces. Operation Sea Lion. With the fall of France, Britain stood alone in Western Europe. Hitler was sure that the British would sue for peace. But Winston Churchill, who had replaced Neville Chamberlain as Prime Minister, had other plans. Churchill's defiance gave voice to the determination of the British. "We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." Winston Churchill, June 4th, 1940. Faced with this defiance, Hitler made plans for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. In preparation for the invasion, he launched massive airstrikes against the island nation. Beginning in August 1940, German bombers began a daily bombardment of England's southern coast. For a month, Britain's Royal Air Force valiantly battled the Luftwaffe. Then the Germans changed their tactics. Instead of bombing military targets in the south, they began to bomb London and other cities. England survives the Blitz. German bombers first appeared over London late on September 7, 1940. All through the night, relays of aircraft showered high explosives and firebombs on the sprawling city. The bombing continued for 57 nights in a row, and then sporadically until the next May. These bombing attacks are known as the Blitz. Much of London was destroyed and thousands of people lost their lives. London did not break under the Blitz. Defiantly, Parliament continued to meet. Citizens carried on their daily lives, seeking protection in shelters, and then emerging to resume their routines when the all clear sounded. Even Churchill and the British King and Queen chose to support Londoners by joining them in bomb shelters rather than fleeing to the countryside. German planes continued to bomb London and other cities off and on until May 1941. But contrary to Hitler's hopes, the Luftwaffe could not gain air superiority over Britain, and British morale was not destroyed. In fact, the bombing only made the British more determined to turn back the enemy. Operation Sea Lion was a failure. Hitler's New Order. As Nazi forces rampaged across Europe, Hitler expanded his plan to build a new order in the occupied lands. Hitler's New Order grew out of his racial obsessions. He set up puppet governments in Western European countries that were peopled by light-skinned Europeans, whom Hitler and his followers believed to be an Aryan master race. The Slavs of Eastern Europe were considered to be an inferior race. They were shoved aside to provide more living space for Germans. To the Nazis, occupied lands were an economic resource to be plundered and looted. The Nazis systematically stripped conquered nations of their works of art, factories, and other resources. To counter resistance movements that emerged in occupied countries, the Nazis took savage revenge, shooting hostages and torturing prisoners. War in North Africa and the Balkans. Axis armies also pushed into North Africa and the Balkans. In September 1940, Mussolini ordered forces from Italy's North African colony of Libya into Egypt. When the British army repulsed these invaders, Hitler sent one of his most brilliant commanders, General Erwin Rommel, to North Africa. The Desert Fox, as he was called, chalked up a string of successes in 1941 and 1942. He pushed the British back across the desert toward Cairo, Egypt. In October 1940, Italian forces invaded Greece. They encountered stiff resistance, and in 1941, German troops once again provided reinforcements. Both Greece and Yugoslavia were added to the growing Axis empire. Even after the Axis triumph, however, Greek and Yugoslav guerrillas plagued the occupying forces. Meanwhile, both Bulgaria and Hungary had joined the Axis alliance. By 1941, the Axis powers, or their allies, controlled most of Europe. Describe how the...
All right, I'm going to pause it there, go to the next page. And real quick, let's scroll down and take a look at the map I mentioned would show up on this page. So advance just within a few years to 1941 and see the drastic change. of Axis power and its control. So it went from Austria and starting to militarize on new territory that they weren't supposed to controlling most of Europe. So huge change. Let's see what happens next.
Nazis attacked the Soviet Union. Tell the story of what happened when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. After the failure in Britain, Hitler turned his military might to a new target, the Soviet Union. The decision to invade the Soviet Union took pressure off Britain. It also proved to be one of Hitler's costliest mistakes.
There goes that honeymoon.
In June 1941, Hitler broke the Nazi-Soviet pact by invading the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa, a plan which took its name from the medieval Germanic leader, Frederick Barbarossa. Hitler made his motives clear. He wanted to gain living space for Germans and to win control of regions rich in resources. If I had the Ural Mountains with their incalculable store of treasures in raw materials, he declared, Siberia with its vast forests, and the Ukraine with its tremendous wheat fields, Germany under National Socialist leadership would swim in plenty. He also wanted to crush communism in Europe and defeat his powerful rival, Stalin. A rapid advance. Hitler unleashed a new blitzkrieg in the Soviet Union. About 3 million German soldiers invaded. The Germans caught Stalin unprepared. His army was still suffering from the purges that had wiped out many of its top officers. The Soviets lost 2.5 million soldiers trying to fend off the invaders. As they were forced back, Soviet troops destroyed factories and farm equipment and burned crops to keep them out of enemy hands. But they could not stop the German war machine. By autumn, the Nazis had smashed deep into the Soviet Union and were poised to take Moscow and Leningrad, present-day St. Petersburg. Winter halts the blitzkrieg. There, however, the German advance stalled. Like Napoleon's Grand Army in 1812, Hitler's forces were not prepared for the fury of general winter. By early December, temperatures plunged to 0 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 18 degrees Celsius. Cold was a killer. German troops had set out in summer and had no warm winter uniforms. Fuel froze in tanks, and much of the Germans' mechanized equipment was useless. Thousands of German soldiers starved or froze to death. Siege of Leningrad. The Soviets, meanwhile, suffered appalling hardships. In September 1941, the 2.5-year siege of Leningrad began. Food was rationed to 2 pieces of bread a day. Desperate Leningraders ate almost anything. For example, a boiled wallpaper scraped off walls because its paste was said to contain potato flour. Although more than 1 million Leningraders died during the siege, the city did not fall to the Germans. Hoping to gain some relief for his exhausted people, Stalin urged Britain to open a second front in Western Europe. Although Churchill could not offer much real help, the two powers did agree to work together. Identify supporting details.
All right.
Why did Hitler nullify the...
And I believe the next page will be the last one. Yes, U.S. involvement in the war.
U.S. involvement in the war. When the war began in 1939, the United States declared its neutrality. Although isolationist feeling remained strong, many Americans, including President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, sympathized with those who battled the Axis powers. In time, Roosevelt found ways around the Neutrality Acts to provide aid, including for Britain, as it stood alone against Hitler. Roosevelt supports the Allies. In March 1941, FDR persuaded Congress to pass the Lend-Lease Act. It allowed him to sell or lend war materials to any country whose defense the president deems vital to the defense of the United States. The United States, said Roosevelt, would not be drawn into the war, but it would become the arsenal of democracy, supplying arms to those who were fighting for freedom. To show further support, Roosevelt met secretly with Churchill on a warship in the Atlantic in August 1941. The two leaders issued the Atlantic Charter, which set goals for the war, the final destruction of the Nazi tyranny, and for the post-war world. They pledged to support the right of all people to choose the form of government under which they will live, and called for a permanent system of general security. Growing tensions with Japan. Although Roosevelt viewed Hitler as the greatest menace to world peace, it was tensions with Japan that finally brought the United States into the war. The United States held several possessions in the Pacific, including the Philippines and Hawaii. When war broke out in Europe in 1939, the Japanese saw a chance to grab European possessions in Southeast Asia. Japanese forces took control across Asia and the Pacific. Japan claimed that its mission was to help Asians escape Western colonial rule. In fact, the real goal was a Japanese empire in Asia. The rich resources of the region, including oil, rubber, and tin, would be of immense value in fighting Japan's war against the Chinese. In 1940, with Europeans distracted by war, Japan advanced into French Indochina and the Dutch East Indies. In response, the United States banned the sale of war materials, such as iron, steel, and oil, to Japan. Japanese leaders saw this move as a threat to Japan's economy and its Asian sphere of influence. Japan and the United States held talks to ease the growing tension, but extreme militarists were gaining power in Japan, including General Hideki Tojo, who became prime minister in 1941. Prior to the war, Tojo had strongly supported the invasion of China and the formation of the alliance with Germany and Italy. Tojo and other militarists hoped to seize more lands in Asia and the Pacific and believed the United States was interfering with their plans. The attack on Pearl Harbor. With talks at a standstill, General Tojo ordered a surprise attack. Early on December 7, 1941, Japanese airplanes bombed the American fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The attack took the lives of about 2,400 people and destroyed battleships and aircraft. The next day, a grim-faced President Roosevelt told the nation that December 7th was a date which will live in infamy. He asked Congress to declare war on Japan. On December 11th, Germany and Italy, as Japan's allies, declared war on the United States. Japanese victories in the Pacific. In the long run, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor would be as serious a mistake as Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. But in the months immediately after Pearl Harbor, European and American possessions in the Pacific fell one by one to the Japanese. The Japanese captured the Philippines and other islands held by the United States. They overran the British colonies of Hong Kong, Burma, and Malaya, advanced deeper into the Dutch East Indies, and completed the takeover of French Indochina. By 1942, the Japanese Empire stretched from Southeast Asia to the western Pacific Ocean. The Japanese invaders treated the Chinese, Filipinos, Malaysians, and other conquered people with great brutality. In China, the Philippines, Malaysia, and elsewhere, they killed and tortured civilians. They seized food crops, destroyed cities and towns, and made local people into slave laborers. Whatever welcome the Japanese had first met as liberators soon turned to hatred. In the Philippines, Indochina, and elsewhere, resistance forces organized to wage guerrilla warfare against the Japanese invaders.
All right, so your last question would be, what role did Japanese imperialism play in World War II? So this whole section here under Japanese victories in the Pacific will help you with that. Imperialism being using power and influence and spreading that to other areas and territories. So now you will answer your final question. And that concludes your reading. Thank you for trying this out with us. Please let us know feedback you may have for this experience you had trying out reading through audio and Edpuzzle. Your feedback is super helpful, and I hope that this worked well and that this helped you learn about this major part of World War II and how the Axis powers were able to advance, but then how that also was met by the Allies. All right. Have a wonderful week and good luck on your other assignments. Bye.